a rewind. The original intent, or at least the original discussion, when we started our 4-year study or curriculum, as we started in Genesis 1:1 nearly 4 years ago and started through, the intent at the time, and as we discussed, was when we finish, we'll just start again. And go through, start back in Genesis 1 and walk back through it all again, because really and truthfully, is there any better thing than just a study of God's complete and thorough Word, and then the repetition of that over and over and over again, and so that had been something that was on our mind for majority of the time through our study. As we came closer to the end, we began to look at pieces of things that maybe have been, we could have addressed better along the way, maybe more thorough in some topics and issues. And so our kids and their classes, they started last Sunday morning, a whole new curriculum, which is a great curriculum from Apologetics Press that is focused on apologetics. It's focused on defending the truth. And it's a study that will go all the way through the Bible. What we're going to do, at least starting now, at least through the end of this year, and maybe a little bit into the beginning of next year, is I'll be using this material. It's called Christ of the Old Testament. It's written by Bob Hornbeck, and you're very familiar with Bob. Bob was a member. Was he an elder of the church for the Northwest congregation in Lawton, Oklahoma? That's where Kelly grew up. That's where her parents are. And I talked to him years and years ago. First time I used this material, the way that he's put this together, it's a survey and a study all the way through the Old Testament, and then also he has done the New Testament as well. But it's a much quicker survey than what we've done over 4 years, but it's more focused. And the focus is looking at the prophecies of Christ. Where can we see Christ in the Old Testament? And the whole story, putting it all together. And I called Northwest a few weeks ago, and I learned that Brother Hornbeck had passed away. And they're not producing this material anymore. And so they sent me a couple of copies. Our intent was to give a copy to everybody because it's a workbook. It's got questions to fill out. You can work on it at home. And our goal, our intent was to get everybody a copy so that you could have it in your hand. And that's just not going to be possible. But this study, as we begin walking through this study, it's a refresher of everything we've just gone through, to bring our minds back to the overall story of Christ from beginning to end. And so that's the purpose of this story. But we are going to, this morning, this is kind of an introduction this morning to this series of what we're going to be going through, kind of laying the groundwork. I'm going to be gone this Wednesday and next Sunday morning to the Bear Valley Lectureship, and so Marcus Wilson is going to take those classes using the same material on Wednesday and Sunday, and we're going to continue this on through. And so when we start off with our study of Christ, it's said there are 300 plus prophecies concerning the Messiah in the Old Testament. And so what this study is going to do is going to be pointing at many of the most prominent prophecies that we have as we walk our way through this study. And this is sometimes referred to as the Messianic strain. The prophecies in the Old Testament, it's kind of amazing the way that God did it. He begins by just planting a little tiny seed that nobody probably really understood. They didn't even realize the significance of it in the very beginning. And the further we go along through time, God plants another seed. You know how I like to use the idea of a puzzle, pieces of a puzzle, where he's gradually giving his people pieces of a big puzzle that ultimately, when that puzzle is complete, is going to be his son, the Christ, on the cross, and the redemption that comes through Jesus. And so all of this from the very beginning. We're going to look at this in a context of what was referred to in the book. He uses what he calls the stream of time. And I wish I was as artistic as he was in his illustration in the book, because the way that he does this is great. I at least got the stream drawn. But he uses mountains along the stream. If you can just imagine with me for a moment, that as the stream kind of twists around, it's curving around mountains. So there are times that the stream gets lost. You can't see it. There's a mountain in the way as the stream is behind it. Then it peeks out from behind and comes around the front of that mountain. You see it again. It reveals itself. And then it goes back behind another hill or another mountain. You don't see it. And then eventually it comes back out. You see it again. That's kind of the picture that he uses here. And that's the way that this messianic stream happens, is God reveals a piece of the promise of a Messiah. And of course, this all begins because of the Garden of Eden, because of sin, as Adam and Eve, as sin enters the world, the fall of man spiritually in the world. And so it's at that point, actually it's before that point, that God already had this whole plan put in place. He already knew, before he even said the words, "Let there be light," God already knew that he was going to have to create a way to redeem mankind. And so this plan of God for the Messiah, as these puzzle pieces are given, God will hand his people one of these pieces of the puzzle. And it gives them a little bit of a picture of something that God's planning on doing sometime in the future. And then God doesn't say anything about it for a long time. And then another event takes place. And God decides it's time to hand them another piece of the puzzle. And so the stream comes out from behind that mountain. You see the plan of God revealed again, at least a part of it. And then maybe a few hundred years goes by. We don't really hear anything else about this plan that God has for his Messiah, for the Redeemer. And then God decides at a certain point, now it's time to give them another piece of the puzzle. And that is the story of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the placing of puzzle pieces from God to reveal the story of his plan for the Messiah that will come one day. And so, and then it isn't until Christ actually appears, when Christ comes to earth, that he brings a bag full of the rest of the pieces of the puzzle. There's so many things that they still did not completely understand. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until his death, burial, and resurrection, and even several days after that, that when Jesus told the apostles in John chapter 14 and John chapter 16 that when the Holy Spirit comes, when the Helper comes, he will guide you into all truth. Well, in a way, that's Jesus saying, I'm going to give you the rest of the pieces of the puzzle so you can put the rest of it together, so that you can see the whole picture. And that's what takes place then throughout the rest of the New Testament, as they begin to reveal the whole message of Christ. And so, in this stream of time, there's even times along here, like in between the Old and New Testament, you have 400 years of silence. But that was a very significant part of history. And in our study, we spent about a month studying that time period when we studied everything chronologically. But it's almost as though God's plan, it kind of disappears. For 400 years, nothing is said until we see the stream appear at the birth of Jesus. And then the story begins to read. And then it kind of gets hidden again for about 12 years. And then we see Jesus at 12 years old in the temple in Jerusalem. Then it gets hidden again for about 18 years. And then we see Jesus at 30 years old when he begins his ministry. And then Jesus begins to place all those pieces of the puzzle together for people to be able to understand it better. And so here's kind of how we're going to be looking at it. First, we need to start with the pre-existent Christ. This is before Christ came to earth. And even we could say before the creation of the world, the universe. Where is God? What is God? Where was Jesus? All of those questions that people ask. Scripture does tell us a lot about Jesus even before the creation of everything. And so we're going to start off. We're going to do this as a timeline. This stream is going to be like a timeline. And so at the very beginning, off in the horizon, we see this stream begin to flow. And so we don't see where it's coming from. It's coming from somewhere beyond the horizon. And that's kind of what we get in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so somewhere out there before the beginning, the horizon is the beginning of time as we know it. Somewhere before that, God was there, and he began to put everything into place. Well, with Jesus also being deity, being God, we see the Apostle John, he's the one who speaks of this beginning as well. When John begins to write his letter, and he begins with the same words that Genesis 1:1 starts with, that immediately it throws the picture into the mind of the people who are reading it of connecting it back with the beginning in Genesis 1. So in Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, in John 1 and verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And all things came into being through him. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being." So there's John's introduction to his entire gospel. In the beginning was John says, the Word is what existed in the beginning with God. Now drop down to verses 14 and 15. Because what does John then reveal to us that the Word is referring to? It says in verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, 'This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me.'" Okay? So, according to the description that John gives there, who is John telling us that this Word is referring to? It has to be Jesus. And so, this is going to be a little heads up as far as we're going through this new series of lessons. I am, you know me, I'm more of a lecture type of teacher usually. I'm going to try to get you a little more involved and as well. So don't be afraid to throw out an answer. If it's the wrong answer, I've had a lot of those before too. Don't worry about it. And so as we go through this, as we look at scriptures, I'm going to be using a lot of the questions and things that come out of this material. And so I want you to be the ones, as you look into the text, to be able then to dig the things out and be able to help with the class and understanding some of these the concepts that God's wanting us to know and understand. Okay, so Jesus from the beginning. Jesus is the Word. In the beginning was Jesus. And Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. That is the connection that John is making there. Now, there's another passage. Turn over to John chapter 8. In John chapter 8 and verse 58. I'll read this, and then I want you to be able to tell me by what John is saying here, how does this connect or add to? What puzzle piece is this adding to the picture of all this together? John 8:58. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." What does that say? What is the significance of what Jesus says there? Okay, when you hear the words "I am," your mind immediately goes back to Sinai or to the burning bush. That mountain, as Moses is going to be back to someday. But as he walks up this mountain as a shepherd, and he sees this bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. And in this conversation that Moses has with God, then we have this question of Moses doubting himself, even doubting God at times. And so finally God has convinced Moses to go back to Egypt, to be the one who's going to lead God's people out of slavery. And Moses, so when I get back, who do I tell them that sent me? And God just simply says, you tell them, I am. That's all they need to know. I am. There's a power in the name of God, in the significance of the I am. And so the Pharisees here and the Jews here in John chapter 8, they are questioning Jesus, they're challenging Jesus, and in verse 57, it said, so the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? And Jesus, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, did the Jews understand what Jesus was saying? Look at the next verse, verse 59. How do we know that they understood what Jesus was referring to? Okay. They believe Jesus is blaspheming God because the very next thing they do, all he says is, I am. And that very next thing it tells us, and they picked up stones to throw at him. They were going to stone Jesus because they understood exactly what he was referring to. They're Jews. They know the story of Moses and the burning bush. They know who the I am is. And Jesus just claimed to be the I am. Jesus just claimed to be the voice that was in the burning bush. And that's what he's doing here. Before Abraham. Moses was before Abraham. And so, he wasn't. As we look back at the plan of God, when God reveals himself to Moses, we then see the whole plan of God through the line of Abraham. And so Jesus making this claim of I'm not just a guy who showed up, a few years ago, less than 50 years ago. So I have always been here, is the claim that Jesus is making. So let's connect this then, still here in the Gospel of John, when Jesus, the night before he was arrested, the night before he was crucified, as he is praying to his Father, in John chapter 17 and verse 5, look and see how this connects as well. It says, now Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. So, what is Jesus really asking of God here? What is the petition? What is the request that Jesus is making of God by a statement like that in a prayer? Okay. 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 Right. So Philippians chapter 2, the emptying himself of that Christ made, of making himself a bondservant, emptying himself of that glory that he had by being God in heaven, and came to earth to be a man. Okay? What is Jesus remembering at this point? What this statement that Jesus makes here in verse 5, what is Jesus remembering? Okay. He is remembering who I am before I came to earth. His mind, he has full recollection of what he has always been. Jesus has full knowledge and understanding, and he can remember what he had with his Father before he came to this earth. And so it's just another statement of Jesus that we see that is referring back to before I existed here as a man in the flesh. This was my reality. My reality was I was with the Father. I am God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so Jesus continues to point to that. Now, according to what Jesus tells his disciples, just back up a chapter to chapter 16, what Jesus tells his disciples this last night before his arrest, in John chapter 16, verses 27 and 28, this also connects it all. He says, I'm going to start in verse 26. In that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will request of the Father on your behalf. For the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came forth from the Father. I came forth from the Father and have come into the world. I am leaving the world again and going to the Father. And so Jesus making point here. We know exactly when Jesus, when he is raised from the dead, and when the apostles, when we see in Acts chapter 1, we see him ascending into heaven, we know exactly where he's going. He is going back to be with the Father. But there's a claim that he's making here along with that. I'm going back to where I started. That's where it all began. I was with the Father because I am God. And so it's all, again, like pieces of a puzzle, or Jesus is helping them to see just exactly who he is. Now, someone flip over to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1. Verses 16 and 17. Somebody read that for me. Okay. So, what does that tell us about Jesus? The pronoun him here is directly referring to Jesus himself. So, the he and the him, what does that tell you about him? Okay, first of all, he's a creator. That started with what John told us in John chapter 1. that all things that have made, there's nothing that has been made that was made without him. So Jesus, the Messiah, is also creator. And that's something that the Apostle Paul is bringing back out again here, is that this Jesus that we serve, he is the one who put it all into existence. What else is here? Which one? Okay. Okay. So it's not just, and man, that's a significant point as far as the whole plan of God, is the existence of Christ, of who he is. That as he existed before time, he existed in our time, and he now continues to exist for all time. That presence of God is significant. That as this story unfolds through the Old Testament, and it seems like it goes dark for a while, and we don't hear much about God's plan. Sometimes for thousands of years, sometimes for hundreds of years, or a dozen years. As the stream goes behind the mountain, and we don't see the plan for a while, there could be the temptation, there could be the idea in the mind of some men that where is God? We thought that he had a plan. And as we go throughout the New Testament, we can continue to see, and the Old Testament, God never stopped being there. He never ceased to exist. He never ceased to be a part of his plan. It was all working the way, and it's easy for us to see it now. As we look back in history and we see how it all unfolded, it's easy for us to see it. But living in the time that they lived in, it may have been hard. Now, we don't know in those times between, well, let's get into this real quick. When we look at the Christ of prophecy, and this is kind of the timeline that we'll walk through, and this is going to be kind of the outline of this study as we go through it. But this timeline, we go back about 4,000 BC, give or take. We look at a timeline of creation. The very first hint then, because of the sin of Adam and Eve, the very first hint that's given to us in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, when the promise is made by God, the punishment is dealt out by God to mankind, Adam and Eve. The punishment because of their sin. There was physical punishment, there was spiritual consequences as well. And in amongst all of that, in Genesis 3:15, God makes a statement. And he says that he is going to send a seed that comes from woman. That's all that's said. Well, I mean, that Satan is going to bruise his heel, but he is going to crush the head of Satan. Okay? There's this little bit of picture that's put out there that something, God has a plan for something, but there's not much said about it. And then this is what we can refer to as kind of the historical record as time began. So this time period between Adam and Abraham. So you have the line now of this Messiah, that this promise, this seed that has been promised now. We see it go through the line of Seth, the son of Adam. And then Seth, ultimately there comes Noah, Noah's son Shem. All of a sudden, through Shem, the Shemite line, the line is identified. And the picture gets a little bit clearer. There's enough pieces of the puzzle put together now that we know that the line of this promised Messiah is going to come through this family of Shem. Shemite. How much do you hear these days of anti-Semitism? Semite comes from Shemite. The Jewish people come from the line of Shem. That's where all that came from. And so when people talk about anti-Semitism, people don't even believe in God. They're actually using biblical language to describe what they're talking about. And so the line is identified. Well, as time goes on then, about a little over 2,000 years passes. We don't hear of anything else. There aren't any other pieces of the puzzle given to us for over 2,000 years. About 1900 BC, we find Abraham. And so Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, God approaches Abraham and tells Abraham, you're going to leave your land. You're going to leave and you're going to go to a new place. And Abraham, by faith, Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 11, he obeys God. And so we look at this as the national period of time because we now know by the promise that God makes to Abraham that all nations are going to be blessed through you. I'm going to make you a great nation. And so now we know the nation that's going to be identified, at least here through Abraham, this one man who is from the line of Shem, is going to be the one that's going to, this plan of God is going to run through. Then find ourselves a couple hundred years later, it all kind of goes quiet. Stream goes behind a mountain for a while. You can't see it. And it goes quiet, and then all of a sudden God reveals another piece of the puzzle. In Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, flip over there. I know we're about out of time. Genesis 49, verse 10. It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. It's the first little piece of the puzzle that's given to us that shows us that of what tribe this line is going to flow through. It's getting a little bit more specific. It's this whole grand, the family of Shem. And it narrows down then to that family of Abraham. Now Abraham has a son, Isaac, who has a son, Jacob, who has 12 sons. Those sons become tribes. And now God narrows it down a little bit more and zooms in the focus of the story that he's telling to one tribe, the tribe of Judah. And so the tribe is identified. Then, over time, we see about 1450, 1500 BC, there's a promise that's made. Now we're back to Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15, God tells Moses, he says that there is one who is coming that is like you. There's going to be a prophet that is going to come that is going to be like you, Moses. He's going to lead God's people out of bondage. And it's another piece of the puzzle of the picture of that Messiah, the Redeemer that's coming. And so it's just one little piece at a time. This is still kind of in this tribal period, but this takes us all the way through Moses, all the way to David. And once we get to the time of David, King David, as the king of Israel, we're about 1000 BC now. And so we then are given this picture of, or in the promises that God makes to David, that it is through your line, your family, that the Messiah will come. And these promises are made. We see it prophesied in Ruth chapter 4 and verse 17. That's the very first time, actually, that we hear of this promise that is made. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 17. It says, the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So we're given a little bit of a hint here of there's something coming through the line of Obed, who is going to have a son, Jesse, who's going to have a son named David. So that's kind of, there's a piece of a puzzle thrown out there. We don't really know what it refers to yet. But then ultimately we see then in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God sends the prophet Samuel to anoint David as king. God makes the promise to David that you and your family will sit on the throne forever. David just happens to be from the tribe of Judah, who happens to be from the line of Abraham, who happens to be from the line of Shem. And so it's all fitting perfectly. And so the one that is going to come through the family of David. And so the family is now identified. And we can go through all the other prophets. Isaiah prophesies the Messiah that is going to be born of a virgin. Micah prophesies of the city of Bethlehem where he's going to be born. Daniel prophesies of the time in which he would be born. In the days of those kings, Daniel chapter 2, the Roman Empire. Malachi prophesies of one who's going to come before the Messiah and prepare the way for him. We later see as John the Baptist. All these prophecies now, and there are 300 plus of these that are laid out all through the Old Testament, that are pieces of the puzzle that are all being put together so that when Jesus comes, Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, but when the fullness of time was come, in other words, when God realized that this is the perfect time for my plan to be fulfilled, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son so that he might redeem those who were under the law. So when the fullness of time, when God saw that the time was perfect, all of the pieces of the puzzle all came together. Go and look. Oh, I'm going to do it. I know they're walking in, but I want to anyway. Stick with me for just a second. Luke chapter 1, verses 30 through 33. Because all of these pieces of the puzzle all come together right here. The angel said to her, as God sends Gabriel to Mary, who is from the family of Judah, from the line of David. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." Now all the pieces are beginning to come together. And so this study, what Marcus is going to begin on Wednesday night, I just gave an overview of the whole thing. Marcus is going to go back and we're going to start at creation and begin to look at the pieces of the puzzle, as each one of these pieces of the puzzle are given by God and their significance and how God uses those to all come back together. And so you can go back the first half of the book of Genesis this week. Spend some time looking through the first half, reading through it of the book of Genesis, and that'll help you out as the classes for the next couple of weeks.
Hi, Piper. How are you?